Van Gogh is an incredible genius, decades ahead of his time. How did it happen that he sold only one painting in his entire life? Now we're going to figure it all out together. Vincent van Gogh was born at dusk on March 30, 1853, to a Protestant pastor's family in Grootsunder, a small southern Holland village. His family would largely shape his life. From early childhood, he was a troublesome child, the only one the nanny didn't like. At 16, he began working as an art dealer in his uncle's gallery. This brought him much closer to art, and soon he decided that he understood it better than the gallery's clients. He wasn't shy about pointing this out to them, and that's why he was fired a few years later. Unlike his younger brother Theo, who would work as an art dealer until the end of his life and become his brother's only financial support. For a while, he wandered without a job, tried several different roles, then got a job at a bookstore, but his restlessness wouldn't let him be, and suddenly he became passionately devoted to religion and went as a preacher to a terrible hole in the mines of Belgium. There, he preached with such fervor that he even scared his own congregation. A couple of years later, he stood up for the miners, for which he was immediately fired. Because it was assumed that his mission was, on the contrary, to calm the workers, not to fight for their rights. There in the mines, among the bleak landscapes and the life of poverty, he first began to think about painting. And in 1880, at the age of 27, he made a decision that would become fateful both for him and for the whole world. He decides to devote himself to art, but in the way he sees it himself, and this will bring him a lot of trouble, but at the same time it is exactly what will make him famous. He moves to Brussels, where he befriends the Dutch artist Anton van Rappard and enrolls in the Academy of Fine Arts, where he studies drawing and perspective. Theo paid for his studies. Here he practices depicting miners, inspired by the paintings of his favorite, Jean-François Millet. And this love defined the style and color palette of his early period. Dutch painting is generally marked by restraint and even gloom. It is important to note that technically Van Gogh painted in the same way, and his palette at that time was dominated by dark, earthy tones, which perfectly reflected the gloomy landscapes of the mines. I would also like to note that by the age of 27, Van Gogh was thin, if not downright skinny, dressed extremely sloppily, and did not take care of his clothes, which made him not the most attractive person in artistic or any other circles. This, along with his difficult personality, made Vincent's communication with the outside world more complicated. In other words, people mostly avoided him. At the Academy, Van Gogh created his first paintings. I've been showing them to you for a while now, and you can see how awkward and unskilled they were. Like any paintings by a beginner artist, it's not surprising. In fact, he started from scratch, but very soon the artist began to have conflicts with his teachers. He absolutely refused to accept the conservative, strict academic methods and principles. It seemed to him that all these rules and requirements made the drawing faceless and sterile. If everyone does things the same way, what is the artist's contribution? Where is he in the painting? For example, how the human body is depicted. It was supposed to start by outlining the contours and then move on to the volume, but Vincent drew the person in parts. And this extremely annoyed the teachers. Besides, he was the oldest in the class, and that created additional awkwardness. As a result, he dropped out in less than a year. But looking ahead, I can say that it was his stubbornness, his unwillingness to strictly follow instructions that would eventually help shape Van Gogh's unique style. However, it wasn't just stubbornness that played a role here, but also another Achilles heel, Vincent's inability to paint human figures. More on that later. All this time, Theo sends him 50 francs every month in letters, and Vincent thanks his brother warmly. After leaving the academy, he goes to Etten to visit his family and see his brother, and there he has one fateful encounter. He meets his cousin Cornelia Adriana Stricker and falls head over heels in love with her almost from the very first meeting. He hastily proposes to her, but she firmly rejects his advances. No, never, Van Gogh would repeat this phrase for years, not believing in its truth. Van Gogh is already 28. It's long past time for him to get married. But essentially, he is an endlessly lonely person, longing for warmth and someone close. Not very pleasant, nervous, unemployed, untidy, and extremely willful. Neither the girl's family nor the girl herself dreams of seeing Vincent as a member of their family. And here again, the character of the future artist shows itself, which will bring him many more troubles in life. He does not accept rejection and begins, by our modern standards, real stalking. He floods her with letters and frequently visits, waiting for her. But when he arrives at the door, the girl quickly leaves, saying, "No, anyone but him." In the end, Vincent convinces himself that Cousina can't accept his courtship because of religious reasons, becomes disappointed in religion, and never believes that the real reason is simply that the woman didn't like him. Riding a wave of skepticism, he refuses to attend church with his family, leading to a terrible argument with his father and Vincent slamming the door again. He moves to The Hague and rents a room in his distant relative Anton Maue's studio, where he starts taking lessons from Maue. Under Anton's guidance, he painted his first watercolors as Anton eagerly shared his knowledge. He taught Van Gogh to hold a palette, mix paints, and most importantly, depict people. A skill that Vincent simply couldn't master, and looking ahead, he never would. Finding models was very hard. They were expensive, and Van Gogh couldn't afford them. And his studio was tiny, so when the model posed, Vincent had to sit almost right next to them, which made it very difficult to take in the whole figure and judge the proportions. Back then, artists would measure proportions with the handle of a brush, holding it at a distance and marking off lengths with their thumb. In the end, things didn't work out with the models or with Anton, whom he quarreled with after only a few months. Van Gogh grew frustrated with his cousin's criticism of his rough style. In a burst of emotion, he replied, "I'm an artist," insisting he paints as he sees things. But it's also a hurtful insult implying his cousin, who rigidly follows academic canons and adds nothing personal, isn't an artist. Anton was offended, and Van Gogh once again left behind the ruins of what used to be a good relationship. Depressed after his cousin's rejection, Vincent, who had suffered from loneliness all his life, decides it's time to make an effort and put an end to his forced bachelorhood. The romantic failure traumatized Vincent, further shaking his already low self-esteem, and his new chosen one turned out to be a pregnant alcoholic street prostitute, Closina Maria Hornig. Can you imagine how desperate the artist was, how much he wanted to have at least someone close, someone safe by his side? That such a dubious union felt like salvation to him? Vincent is thrilled. He finally has someone by his side, even if they're lower in status and have a questionable reputation, but they're not judgmental and actually depend on him. A brilliant business plan is forming in Van Gogh's mind, inspired by himself. She will pose for him for free, a luxury he never had, and he will sell her portraits, providing for both of them. But as we know, that will never happen. Van Gogh sold only one painting in his entire life. The Van Gogh family is deeply religious, led by a Protestant pastor. He is horrified by the news, and Theo tries to dissuade his brother from this foolish idea. Theo made it clear to Vincent that his support does not extend to this ridiculous match and that his brother risks losing his help. However, due to family pressure, Van Gogh abandons the idea of marrying Closine. Yes, besides, even her relatives stood firmly against this event, claiming that Vincent is a worthless idler without a penny to his name, and their union falls apart. After a quarrel with Anton, Vincent was forced to move out of his cousin's studio and rent a small room, which he now had to pay for. Then the tax authorities visited him too. He started being hounded by paint sellers to whom he owed money, and one of them even beat up the artist. In the end, Van Gogh fled from The Hague and returned once again to his father's house, who by that time had been transferred to Nuenen, a town with many weaving factories. The family was already fed up with Vincent's antics, instability, and inability to care for himself. Van Gogh was a complex person, indecisive, nervous, insecure, and searching for purpose. You can already see that Van Gogh's early works were sketches of what he saw around him: peasants, weavers, the gloomy landscapes of Northern Europe, wheat fields. The artist was drawn to real life, its most natural expressions, the so-called realism, which was strongly disapproved of by academic circles. You can learn more about this in my video about Edouard Manet. Lacking the skill and resources to paint large canvases and narrative scenes, he tried to practice on what he saw around him. And the problem of finding a model led to the fact that Van Gogh himself would be his main model throughout his life. He would create 34 self-portraits of himself, using his own face to practice techniques and color schemes. In that same year, 1885, after 5 years of painting, he created his first notable painting, The Potato Eaters, which at first no one liked. He spent a long time on the painting, which had 5 characters. He repeatedly sketched and revised each one. 5 years of practice were embodied in this painting, a painting of challenge, a painting of revelation. It was a challenge to the technical skill of a beginning artist and a revelation of what touched his soul the most. This dark, earthy painting exudes hopelessness, without any unnecessary decorations, showing the lives of the poorest people who have only a single potato for dinner. Van Gogh really liked the painting, but what do you think? Did other people like it? Did anyone want to hang it in their living room? Of course not. The gloomy painting by an unknown artist wasn't liked by anyone, not even his brother Theo, who thought it was too depressing. Then the restless Vincent decided to sell it to the peasants themselves, and with Theo's help, he made 20 lithographs which were very cheap. We don't know what happened to them. Only 8 have survived to this day. But I doubt that people who only had enough money for potatoes would buy paintings. This crazy venture obviously failed. He showed one of the lithographs to Rappard and he criticized it for exactly what Van Gogh was especially weak at. Let me remind you that by that time, Impressionism was already flourishing in Paris, but in the Netherlands, academicism still reigned. That means the quality of a painting was judged solely by its realism and accuracy. And Rappard writes to Vincent about this painting. Why don't you study the movements thoroughly? The woman's hand in the background looks unrealistic, and why doesn't the man on the right have knees, a stomach or lungs, or maybe they're on his back? Why is his arm missing a meter in length? Why is half of his nose gone? And why does the woman on the left have a pipe handle with a plate instead of a nose? And you still dare working like this, to quote Millet and Breton, art is too elevated to be treated so carelessly. You recognize exactly the same tone that critics used against the Impressionists. This criticism literally infuriated Van Gogh, and yet another relationship went down the drain. Just think about it. Vincent, who suffers deeply from loneliness, breaks off relationships without hesitation with anyone who doesn't understand his art. On one hand, it's utter foolishness and incredible impracticality, but on the other hand, we see in it a blind confidence in his own abilities. There's an important point about Van Gogh's dark palette to note. Natural paints in the 19th century varied in price depending on the pigment. The most expensive were ultramarine blue, carmine red, and vermilion bright red. Ochre yellow or red brown was a bit cheaper, while black, brown, and white were the cheapest. The palette of Van Gogh's early paintings was so dark not only because the world around him was gloomy, and this was typical for the Dutch school, but also because he couldn't afford bright paints. However, just as he didn't feel them himself. At the same time, the tiny town of Nuenen offered no opportunities for contact with other artists or for learning. Van Gogh began to feel suffocated, and Van Gogh decided to leave for a place where he would have access to everything and where no one knew him. To the vast Antwerp, a major artistic center where he could start everything from scratch. There, he enrolls in courses at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Antwerp, which he pays for again, and he practices a lot by drawing bodies from plaster models. I'll show you these training paintings, although they have no artistic value. But guess what will happen in less than 6 months? In a situation where someone decided to teach Van Gogh painting in Antwerp, his palette becomes lighter. For the first time, new chemical paints are available to him. By the 1880s, the Industrial Revolution had reached painting as well. Instead of expensive natural paints, chemical ones appeared, and their prices didn't differ as much from each other. As a tribute to tradition, but soon even this difference will vanish. However, even in this situation, Van Gogh has no money. He mostly lives on bread and coffee, so he still can't afford the most expensive shades. The thirst to learn and discover new things, unfortunately, wasn't limited to painting. In Antwerp, he contracted syphilis, and although the disease could already be treated, at that time, the treatment was harsh, and as a result, he lost almost a third of his teeth, which weren't very strong to begin with. And at the academy, Van Gogh predictably had problems with the professors. He did everything his own way, and in the teacher's opinion, his drawings made the professors look like fools, unable to teach an already quite grown man. Van Gogh is already 32, and naturally he starts having conflicts with the academy's instructors. He refuses to follow their instructions and draws with broad strokes, which they consider sloppy. Notice, not exactly. Maybe you recall the Impressionists were criticized for this very lack of precision in painting, but by 1885 in Paris, they had already overcome these outdated rules. However, these trends had not yet reached Antwerp, and Van Gogh was a complete nobody, so no one cared about his opinion. After months of struggling with Van Gogh, the teachers moved him to the remedial class, which deeply offended Vincent. In the end, unable to cope with his dire financial situation and the conflicts growing around him like mushrooms, Van Gogh once again abandons everything halfway and runs off to Paris to his brother without warning. And this is where the Van Gogh we all know begins. Be patient, the best part is about to start. Subtitles by Dima Torzok. Vincent van Gogh's Paris period will last very briefly, less than 2 years, but it will be one of his most productive and energetic periods, a time of searching for his own style. In Paris, he moves in with Theo. Of course, Theo wasn't prepared for his brother's sudden arrival, but in the end, they work things out, and Vincent stays under Theo's care. Here, when he didn't have to look for money just to buy a piece of bread, he works very hard, visits museums, and finally gets to see Impressionism with his own eyes. In 1886, the very last of the 8 Impressionist exhibitions was taking place, and Van Gogh visited it. He was struck by the brightness of the palette, but most importantly, he realized that it wasn't necessary to paint according to academic rules. You can experiment, you can be yourself, you can challenge conservatism and still be successful. The Impressionists still had 6 years before gaining real recognition, but they had already fought for 20 years to paint in a revolutionary new style. And although they hadn't achieved complete success yet, their names were widely known, and some of them could fully support themselves with their paintings. You can learn more about this in my awesome video about the Impressionists. Be sure to check it out, the link will be in the description. Chemical paints in Paris were much more accessible, they were sold in tubes already mixed, and to Van Gogh. Finally, the most expensive colors, blue, red, and yellow, became available, and soon you'll see that these very colors will dominate his palette. Another discovery for him would be the Impressionist technique of preparing the canvas, priming it not with dark but with white paint. Chemical paints also didn't need to be covered with varnish, which was usually dark and dulled the bright tones even more. And all these technical innovations seem to turn on a bright light in his paintings. They simply explode with color. That's what Vincent always wanted but could never afford. At this time, he was 33 years old. The brothers moved to Montmartre, Paris's bohemian hub, where Van Gogh began meeting contemporary artists for the first time. He met Émile Bernard and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, becoming close friends with them, as well as Paul Gauguin, Georges Seurat, Paul Signac, Camille Pissarro, and Paul Cézanne. For the first time, he was among artists who stood out from academic monotony by thinking and painting unconventionally. A goal, not a crime. He also becomes acquainted with Japanese prints. Japan opened its borders 30 years ago, and Europe was swept by a wave of Japanomania. Van Gogh, like many artists of that time, admired the Japanese art of hokusai and made copies of Japanese prints. Japanese art strongly influenced Van Gogh. These strokes on pristine gap paper would soon become embodied in Van Gogh's long, winding brushstroke, his discovery, signature, and legacy. He began by practicing still lifes and landscapes, copying the Impressionist technique. Look at how much his palette already differs from his earlier paintings of that time, which could easily be called Impressionist. Short, hesitant brushstrokes, light tones, and reflections. The shaded areas of objects also take on different hues. They're no longer black, dark, or gloomy tones. In fact, it's as if they flee from his paintings in shame, banished by the new bright palette. I want to draw your attention to this painting. This is his first such experiment, a long brush stroke that makes the painting resemble a comical, primitive drawing. By itself, it isn't very well known, but for us to trace the entire evolution of Van Gogh's style, it's worth paying attention to it. In addition to technical innovations, Van Gogh learns about the latest complementary color theory from Signac, the founder of pointillism, and he becomes so fascinated by it that soon the artist will use only them. Complementary colors are opposite the primary colors, blue, red, and yellow, on the color wheel. Yellows is purple, reds is green, and blues is orange. And the theory of complementary colors in Impressionism says that mixing a primary and a complementary color creates what's called optical mixing, which gives the painting dynamism and makes the painting vibrate visually. Van Gogh starts experimenting with this approach. Take a look at the painting Moulin de la Galette. It's a windmill. Van Gogh painted it many times, but in this particular painting, he used his favorite contrast of yellow or orange and blue for the first time. And look at what he achieved. I'll show you on purpose how this windmill looks in reality. And now let's go back to the painting. The windmill is done in a bluish color, and this immediately gives the space a sense of summer haze, as if the very air between us and the windmill creates a matte, gentle mist. It's the palette of the painting that gives character to what seems to be a rather ordinary landscape. And look at the wall. Here is that very contrast of complementary colors, in my opinion, still very cautious and not the most successful, somewhat chaotic. But we can see that gradually Van Gogh is finding his style in Paris thanks to the abundance of contacts with other artists. He also gets some models, but it's still expensive for him, so he starts experimenting a lot on himself. Soon, Toulouse-Lautrec introduces him to Agostina Segatori, who owned the Tambourine Café and was a model for many artists, and a romantic relationship begins between them. Many artists gathered at the Tambourine Café and sometimes organized exhibitions there. Van Gogh soon paints the famous portrait A. Agostina Segatori is seated in the Tambourine Café, along with other paintings created specifically for the café by agreement with the owner. Essentially, this becomes his first exhibition, but visitors and artists do not like his paintings. Van Gogh's brushwork, still uncertain and a bit immature, seems unprofessional, rough, and too emotional to them. And it seemed like everything was finally starting to get better, but even this love would not last very long. We don't know the reasons for the quarrel, but soon after, Segatori had an abortion, likely due to an unplanned child. Whether the child was Vincent's or not is unknown, but in his letters, Vincent writes about the abortion with frustration. After the quarrel, Vincent demanded that the paintings hanging on the walls be returned to him as collateral, but the owner of the cafe refused to give them back, stating that Vincent had used her cafe and herself as a model without proper payment. A scandal erupted, including a fight with a man. When Van Gogh tried to take the paintings by force, Vincent suspected the owner had hired a thug to beat and scare him off so she could keep the paintings. Van Gogh couldn't stand being treated that way and slammed the door in frustration. However, since it was impossible to take the paintings, the cafe soon went bankrupt and Agostina was unable to sell a single Van Gogh painting. Apparently, the priceless paintings were either destroyed or lost forever. As you can see, neither the owner nor Paris saw any value in the paintings of the then unknown Van Gogh, and his relationships with Parisian artists were also difficult. He writes to Turpin, "I didn't even know who the Impressionists were, now I've seen them, and although I'm not a member of the club, I still admired some of the paintings by the Impressionists Degas and Claude Monet." He brought his early paintings to Paris, where the Parisian bohemia found them gloomy, rough, and crude. Everyone saw his talent, but few thought Van Gogh already painted skillfully. Toulouse-Lautrec, for example, respected the strength and expression of Van Gogh's brushwork, but considered it too wild for the Parisian salons. Camille Pissarro was very sympathetic to him and advised him to work more en plein air, outdoors, while Paul Cézanne spoke of him reservedly, considering his style too chaotic and emotional. Most critics, artists, and viewers agreed that Van Gogh's paintings were commercially unviable and not suitable for major exhibitions. And as for the conservative artists, most of them simply mocked his works. The Segatori incident showed Van Gogh that selling his paintings directly in Paris without an art dealer was pointless. He meets Julien François Tanguy, a Parisian marchand art dealer, and at the same time a seller of painting supplies. Everyone used his nickname, and he was among the first to buy impressionist paintings, often providing money and supplies in exchange for their art. Van Gogh painted 3 portraits through barter, which Tanguy displayed in his workshop's back room, also used as a sales gallery. Though he never sold a single Van Gogh painting, Van Gogh, who cared deeply for Tanguy, ended up arguing with his wife, who insisted on cash instead of paintings. This naturally cooled the artists' relationship. Paul Durand-Ruel, the main art dealer for the Parisian Impressionists, who fought hard for their recognition, also saw no value in his paintings. Watch this video on the Impressionists. After Van Gogh died, Durand-Ruel helped make him popular. Unfortunately, he never recognized his talent during his lifetime. The chaotic, dirty Paris life weighed on Vincent. He immersed himself in the city, studied again with renowned teacher Fernand Cormon, and improved his color work, yet he always felt like a second-rate artist. Surrounded by colleagues who, while not yet recognized, were quite successful, regularly exhibiting at salons and socializing, and among whom a certain hierarchy was already forming, in which Van Gogh unfortunately was at the very bottom, even though he was far from the youngest. The French beau monde treated Van Gogh respectfully, since he was an art dealer's brother, but remained distant. He had only painted for a few years and hadn't attended art school. His painting style was rough and unusual, and all of this made those around him treat him more with prejudiced caution than with genuine interest. This was a time when the old group of Impressionists had broken up, everyone was looking out for themselves, artists often quarreled, and Van Gogh often found himself awkwardly caught in the middle. Still, he managed to make friends with a few people. For example, with Paul Gauguin, who was as poor and unrecognized as Van Gogh, and with Émile Bernard, with whom they often argued about art's direction. Van Gogh didn't get along with the other artists, and this weighed heavily on him. I want to show you a painting that Van Gogh created in the summer of 1887 in Paris. Few know this, but this is the first canvas where he cautiously used his signature long, nearly parallel strokes. Such rhythmic geometric shapes are very rare in nature. They're almost always the result of human activity. Fields, buildings, rows of grapevines, bridges. It's in this landscape that you now see this technique, which he would soon use everywhere and develop into a new style. At the same time, signs of mental illness appeared for the first time. The tension of the big, indifferent city, combined with endless absinthe, which was very popular among the Parisian elite at the time, brought to the surface the dormant consequences of his past syphilis, the most common of which was madness. He starts to feel uncomfortable in the city, and Van Gogh once again begins to develop the idea of escaping, but this time to the south of France, as he said, a country of blue and bright colors. He wrote, "I'll go somewhere to the south so I don't have to see all these crowds of artists who, as people, disgust me." Almost at the very end of his stay in Paris, he painted 2 self-portraits in which his future style of brushstroke-like strokes is already very clearly emerging. Pay attention to these elongated brushstrokes, which he arranges in such a way that they seem to flow one after another along a path set by the artist. They spread across the face like rays and circle the lapels and hat. Van Gogh's brushstrokes resemble busy caterpillars, tracing object contours and highlighting their shape. This creates an effect of movement, a dynamic that is completely different from the Impressionist brushstroke. This movement is entirely invented, entirely subject to Van Gogh's imagination. And he, as a creator, with the help of his faithful assistants, constructs magic even in the empty space around his head. I'll continue telling you about the self-portrait, and you pay attention to these brush strokes to this effect. This is Van Gogh's calling card. Paris's art world doesn't realize his emotional paintings are unfamiliar even to the Impressionists, who disapproved. Emphasized expressive brushstrokes and presentation. They will become the beginning and main source of Expressionism, a major and enduring movement in painting that remains popular today and is one of the 3 main directions of post-impressionism. And although living in Paris is becoming increasingly unbearable for Van Gogh, he really doesn't want to be alone again. And then his long and persistent desire to create together with his brother transforms into the idea of creating an art commune. A kind of brotherhood of like-minded people secluded in the wilderness, far from the city and its arrogance and demands, working side by side to create new art. Art free from any prejudice, art for art's sake as the highest value in the world. He shares his thoughts with Gauguin and Bernard, and after receiving polite approval, in 1888 he leaves for the small town of Arles in the south of France. The place where his talent will shine, the place where he will cut off his ear and end up in the hospital, the place where he will paint Starry Night. He arrives in Arles in February 1888. When snow is still everywhere, he immediately creates 3 winter landscapes and continues working while waiting for spring with portraits. Here it's just as hard. Finding a model in a small town is tougher than in Paris. The local people simply don't understand this strange occupation of being an artist and drawing strangers. Simple people live here, and sitting alone with a scruffily dressed skinny artist while he sketches you is unusual for them. They found it inappropriate, and girls were strictly forbidden to be alone with a man. While connecting with locals, Vincent mainly painted landscapes and still lifes. A little later, he found a way to approach the men. He would pay them by inviting them to the local tavern, basically treating them to drinks in exchange for their portrait. I'll show you a painting where another typical feature of Vincent's later period appeared for the first time. Soon spring came, and Arles was filled with colors. This was exactly what Vincent had been waiting for, the reason he came to this remote place, the very paradise of flowers. He writes, "I don't need Japanese art at all, because I imagine myself in Japan, and all I need are my eyes. To see what's before me with the trees, no need to ask them to pose or remind them." He writes about blooming apple, peach and pear trees. And in this painting, look, for the first time he very clearly outlines the dark contours of the tree, a manner that he hadn't shown before. After some time, this kind of outlining, separating different planes of the painting will become present in most of his works. This technique will later gain popularity in France. In order to handle perspective better, Vincent invents what he called a perspective frame. It was a 1-meter wooden frame with crisscrossing strings creating a converging perspective. Van Gogh looked through it at the landscape he was depicting and transferred the proportions and perspective lines of roads, fields and buildings onto the canvas. He was sure that soon all artists would start using it and even sent its sketches to Theo, but experienced artists didn't need any tools to feel perspective. The camera obscura had long fallen out of use. Artists had learned to see perspective with the naked eye. That's why Van Gogh's invention, which he was so proud of, remained unused. Meanwhile, Theo manages to get some of his paintings displayed at the Independence exhibition in Paris. However, none of them were sold again. At the start of summer, he meets postman Joseph Roland and often paints his family. His network grows, and portraits increasingly dominate his work. His collection even includes a young girl, La Mousme. We don't know who she is, but it is known that there was a brothel in Arles that Van Gogh often visited, and apparently she was one of its workers. No other girl in this backwater would have agreed to pose for a strange, twitchy man. But the arrival of spring and then summer gives Van Gogh so much room for painting that it doesn't bother him much. The only thing that weighs on him is loneliness. He actively writes to Theo and his Parisian friends Gauguin and Bernard, inviting them to Arles to form an artists' community. But Bernard is captivated by Paris, especially its women, which Arles lacks even though he lives in poverty. But Gauguin is in such a dire financial situation, he was deep in debt, that Theo finds a way to entice the artist and please his brother. He offers to pay Gauguin's debts for his paintings, which he'll sell, and to fully support both artists financially. In Arles, Gauguin considers it for a while and finally agrees in August, seeing it as profitable. Van Gogh is delighted. He finds a yellow house not far from Arles, and Theo sends him 300 francs so he can rent and prepare everything for the future studio of the two artists. The rent costs him 15 francs a month, and Van Gogh happily moves in, after first, as usual, having an argument with the owner of the hotel where he had been staying because of an excessively large bill. The Van Gogh brothers hoped the Artel would eventually grow into the core of a new movement opposing refined Paris. But for now, inspired, Vincent decides to decorate the studio he shares with Gauguin with paintings, and in August of '88 he creates the famous Sunflower series. First 3, then 5, 12 and finally 15, 4 paintings total. At the end of the summer he met Eugène Boch, a Belgian artist who came to Arles on the advice of friends. In his letters, Van Gogh speaks very warmly of him, and in September of '88 he paints his portrait, which will mark the beginning of a new meaning in painting. Let me dwell on him in a bit more detail. Here is how Van Gogh himself described him. Recently, I painted the portrait of our friend Boch. I placed him against a background of a starry sky, and there is something infinite in it. I wanted to show that in the eyes of the artist, there is something more than himself. His dreams. Notice the stars in the portrait's background. In Van Gogh's description, they are the symbol of the artist's inner light, and this symbolism is something new, different from the strict realism of all his previous paintings. This is where the artist takes his first steps in adding elements of imagination to his paintings. Remember, in his early period, he argued with his teachers that simply copying reality is fruitless. There is nothing of the artist himself in such paintings. It's sterile, decorative art. And here he gradually begins to find that contribution, the imprint of the artist's personality on the canvas, which will make his paintings unique. And this is where the artist's imagination is most complete. This small, timid step will, in 20 years, evolve into surrealism brilliantly seen in the famous works of Salvador Dalí. If the Impressionists strove in their paintings to capture the impression, the fleeting emotion that the beautiful external world produced on them, then Van Gogh goes further and adds to his canvases what his imagination creates. Not the influence of the landscape on the artist, but the influence of the artist on the landscape. Much later, this became known as Expressionism, the artist's emotional outpouring on canvas. But for now, no one even knows such a word. He writes, "Instead of trying to accurately depict what is in front of my eyes, I use color more freely in order to express myself as fully as possible. I'm trying to develop a simple technique that apparently won't be impressionist." Also in September, he paints his famous Night Cafe, Night Terrace Cafe and Starry Night. Notice how he paints the color of the lamps and stars like halos with radiating circles. At night in Arles, it was almost completely dark. There was no street lighting and only the cafe was the single bright spot in the whole town. Here, his new color scheme is already fully emerging, the dominance of blue and yellow. I think by now you can easily distinguish Van Gogh from any other artist by his distinctive brushstroke that follows the contours of objects, the dark outline and the yellow-blue palette. It's hard for Van Gogh to work. His health has been seriously undermined by years of hunger, his stomach is failing, and the endless drinking and poor wine at the only cafe only make things worse. Van Gogh often complains of feeling unwell, and during this time his letters first show signs of anxiety. After his sister's mental illness, Van Gogh comes to the conclusion that psychosis runs in the family, and sooner or later it will catch up with him too. He already feels the impending trouble. He sends Theo one painting after another, but there is still no good news about sales. And at the end of October, Gauguin finally arrives and the artists begin working together. He is a very, very interesting person, and I am absolutely sure that together we will create a whole lot of things. He will probably produce quite a bit. Here I hope as well. I feel the need to work until complete physical exhaustion and moral breakdown. After all, it's the only way for me to make up for our expenses. What can I do if my paintings don't sell? Gauguin is painting the Night Cafe too. Notice how different the artist's style is in version A. Meanwhile, Theo managed to sell Gauguin's paintings quite well, the ones he left as collateral for his debts. And then there was another sale, and Theo wrote to Vincent that he was very pleased. But Theo couldn't manage to sell Van Gogh's paintings at all, and of course, this created tension between the artists. Artists are always competing, there's nothing unusual about that, but when one of the outsiders suddenly starts to get ahead, the other always feels it's unfair. In his letters, Van Gogh doesn't even hint at any rivalry. But after praising Gauguin, he immediately tries to talk about his own new paintings, like telling his brother, "I can do it too, trust me." Van Gogh and Gauguin work daily and spend evenings eating and drinking at a cafe. Gauguin is very popular with the local women, while the sloppy, toothless Van Gogh is avoided by women. Jana Kalman, who spent her entire life in Arles, claimed she met Van Gogh in her father's shop at age 13. The artist seemed dirty, poorly dressed and unfriendly to her, and she refused to serve him. Because he was as ugly as sin, had a nasty temper and smelled of alcohol. Well, you and I already know that her words were not far from the truth. And in November, the Belgian Art Association Group 20 invited Gauguin to participate in their exhibition. This greatly inspired the artist, and he began making plans to travel to Brussels, where his wife lived. And here, Van Gogh's tone towards Gauguin changes. He writes to Theo Posthumous with skepticism. However, he is popular with the women of Arles. This, as I see it, will inevitably have consequences. He's married, yet doesn't seem like it. I'm afraid that he and his wife have completely different personalities, but for him, of course, the main thing is not her, but the children who, judging by the portraits, are very beautiful. Well, you and I don't really understand these things. At the same time, Van Gogh admires Gauguin's style, his paintings, and persistently sends his works to Theo, showing Van Gogh's paintings to colleagues and other artists. But they say that they look rushed, unfinished, mostly because of the awkward human figures, which Theo tells him about. Of course, Vincent took the criticism very hard. "You won't lose anything if you wait a little for the arrival of my new works. As for the current ones, let our dear colleagues despise them as much as they want. Fortunately, I know exactly what I want, and accusations that I work hastily leave me completely indifferent. Can you imagine what it's like to work your whole life and never get any approval? To create hundreds of paintings, at that time more than 600, but not sell a single one, not a single painting out of 600 works, painted just to be kept in a drawer. What kind of person would have the patience not to give up? What kind of passion must you have to keep going despite reproaches, criticism, ridicule, and the painful success of your peers? If by 40 I create a figurative work as good as the flowers Gauguin admired, I can see myself as a painter equal to others. That's why perseverance and perseverance again. By figurative composition, he means precisely people in motion, which he still can't quite manage. This trait, seen as a flaw, sadly keeps his colleagues from recognizing a different talent in Van Gogh. Primitivism's era hasn't arrived yet, and Van Gogh was born too soon, though without him it might never have come. Van Gogh and Gauguin argue a lot about art, and their arguments are becoming increasingly heated. As Vincent said, they criticize each other's methods. Gauguin notes Vincent always argues and wants things done his way, but Gauguin has his own vision, style, and plans. It becomes increasingly difficult for them to coexist, and some everyday challenges of living together also start to emerge. Late autumn comes gloomy and monotonous, and Van Gogh sees that Gauguin, along with nature, is growing cold toward Karl. This worries him a lot. Most of all, he's afraid of being left alone again, as he has been all his life. And then comes the news that Theo has fallen in love and is planning to get married, which means his brother will inevitably grow distant. All of this, of course, stirred the already troubled waters of Van Gogh's mind. His fear of being alone made him suspicious. The signs of mental instability, which had been progressing for some time, became more pronounced. Living with Vincent was unbearable, endless arguments, anger, and distrust. I understood that he was ill, but staying there meant putting myself in danger, Gauguin recalls. And on December 23, just a couple of days before Christmas, one of their heated arguments turned into a real fight. We don't know the details or the reasons, but here's what Gauguin himself says in his reproach to Vincent after what happened. Your life was hanging by a thread. That evening, you rushed at me with a razor in your hand, my look stopped you, and you ran home. I stayed at a hotel overnight, and the next morning, I learned you had cut off your ear. That's how that famous episode with the cut-off ear began, which I think you've already heard about. I didn't lead you up to this moment in such detail for nothing. I wanted you to fully imagine the situation. Given Van Gogh's fear about Gauguin leaving and his suspicion, the ground for a quarrel was already well prepared. All it needed was the slightest spark for accusations of betraying their cause to start flying. I think that's what happened. Van Gogh snapped and lashed out at his friend. But Gauguin was a good fencer, and apparently he grabbed his sword, which he was said to always carry with him, to defend himself. And that stopped Vincent, and then Gauguin simply left the Yellow House to get away from his unstable colleague and stayed at a hotel. Vincent, frightened by his own aggression, in a state of severe nervous crisis and despair, wounded himself, punishing himself for destroying a friendship that was so important to him. It was believed that Van Gogh only cut off his earlobe, but 11 years ago, records were discovered from Vincent's attending physician in Arles, Felix Rey, who admitted him to the hospital, and they clearly state that the ear was completely cut off. After that, things got even stranger. Apparently, in a state of stupor, Van Gogh wrapped his ear in paper and went to the brothel where he often visited and handed it to one of the prostitutes, Rochelle, saying, "Take care of this as a treasure." After that, he went outside, lost consciousness, and was found by the police and taken to the hospital. Gauguin of Arles never returned to the Yellow House and soon left Arles, not even wanting to speak with Van Gogh. Van Gogh spent 3 weeks in the hospital, and after returning, painted his famous self-portrait with a bandaged ear. The bandaged ear appears on the right, though he cut off his left ear. As a right-hander, he likely painted it using a mirror. There are 2 versions of the portrait, and in one of them, he is holding a pipe to give the appearance of calmness. And this desire is also understandable because the incident seriously worried Theo, who was told everything. He immediately rushed to Arles, took care of his brother, and settled everything with the police. This breakdown, like a burst dam, signaled the collapse of the artist's unstable psyche. After Gauguin left, he began to have hallucinations and schizophrenic thoughts that someone wanted to poison him in this state. He wandered through quiet Arles, scaring the residents. 4 weeks later, he is hospitalized again with paranoia symptoms for 10 days, but after discharge, he faces residents unwilling to risk themselves. Everyone in Arles considered him insane and collected signatures for the mayor to expel the dangerous madman from the city. Van Gogh's life in Arles becomes difficult. Residents avoid him, Gauguin leaves, and while Van Gogh is in the hospital, the Yellow House's owner decides to rent it out again, despite Van Gogh having renovated it. Vincent van Gogh is deeply affected by Gauguin's departure, fearing Gauguin will tell others in Paris about what happened, ruining Van Gogh's already slim chances of success. But as if to balance out all the hell the artist is going through, soon he will make his first sale. Continued. Theo knew Van Gogh couldn't live alone in Arles or return to Paris, so he suggested his brother be admitted to the psychiatric hospital in Saint-Rémy de Provence. It was an expensive and well-equipped institution that seemed to Theo like the perfect place where his brother would be cared for and safe. And above all, safe from himself. Van Gogh agreed, and in May 1889 he moved into the hospital. Theo arranged for him to have a studio here, but unfortunately it didn't have any windows. But the hospital had a beautiful garden with irises, and here Van Gogh painted his famous irises. He was allowed to paint in the garden, and here in the calm of the hospital on full board, without outside contacts, without stress. The most distinctive and important quality of his paintings is starting to emerge. His brushstroke, which used to be short and elongated, now becomes long and swirling. This is exactly how he paints cypresses and irises, repeating the movement of the leaves with the direction of his brushstroke. Look, it's as if we can see the cypress twisting under the influence of the wind. This is the final stage in the development of his remarkable style, when Van Gogh actually begins to model movement. In June 1889, after a month in Saint-Rémy, Van Gogh painted his Starry Night. His room has one small barred window. He paints in the studio or garden during the day, and at night watches the stars from his window. He painted this picture from memory, and it became the apotheosis of his imagination. He didn't paint it as he saw it, layering his brush stroke over reality. He invented it completely. Such a landscape never existed, and no one had ever seen such swirls in the sky, but no one had ever seen such dynamism in an ordinary starry night landscape either. If you've watched my videos, you know that artists very often painted from memory in their studios. But usually their goal was to reproduce what they saw as accurately as possible, as close to photographic realism as they could. Van Gogh takes a new, unexpected, I would even say revolutionary step here. He rejects resemblance and gives priority to the artist's imagination, his self-expression, which is what he always wanted. He transfers to the canvas not the image that remains in memory, but the dreams that embrace us when we lie on the cool summer grass and look into the dizzyingly bottomless sky full of countless stars. Vincent likes it in the clinic. He feels at peace there. He doesn't have to worry about anything, and in the intervals between his episodes, he can fully immerse himself in his work. This is immediately reflected in his paintings. His style makes a leap, and the canvases seem to be woven from movement, from winding, swirling lines. As far as I understand, he needs to continue the treatment. My stay here costs less than anywhere else, and besides, I can work. The nature here is magnificent. I hope in a year, I'll better understand what I can do and want. Then, little by little, I will find the strength to start over, to return to Paris or go somewhere else. I don't feel like it right now. My place is here. In the summer, he sends several paintings to the independent exhibition, including Irises and Starry Night over the Rhone, that very starry night. He doesn't dare to show his most famous painting now, the one praised by critics. It seems too eccentric to him, and he has already been burned by criticism for his boldness more than once. And unexpectedly, Claude Monet himself says that Van Gogh's Irises is the best painting at the exhibition, and it truly is magnificent, isn't it? And that was the first recognition for the upstart and self-taught, unpleasant and untidy artist whom no one took seriously. This event was very important for Van Gogh, for his self-esteem. It's a pity that he only had 6 months left to live. In January 1890, he received an invitation to participate in the exhibition of the 20, and he sent his Red Vineyards painting there. The public's reaction was reserved, but the Belgian artist Anna Boch bought this painting for 400 francs. This was probably the happiest day in Van Gogh's life. Finally, someone bought his painting. His work started gaining attention, possibly due to rumors about the recent incident. Later at the Salon of the Independence. In January, he sends as many as 10 paintings, which are received more favorably by the public. People are getting used to his extraordinary style, and he begins to receive his first timid recognition in the clinic. Van Gogh, he grew stronger physically, mentally, and most importantly, creatively. His own style has matured and developed into something completely unique for that time. He begins to test his new strength and new style. In copying the paintings of recognized masters, the last and most difficult peak for him was human figures. His unique technique became its own aesthetic, with early awkwardness turning into the defining feature of his paintings. An organic artist's touch within swirling brushstrokes. Look at the painting of the drunkard, created after the work of the same name by Damier. Let's compare them. It seems to me that thanks to the long winding brushstroke, we can almost see the drunken, unsteady movements of these drinkers and the contortion of their faces. A little later, in the same February, he painted his famous Prisoner's Walk, as well as a couple more practiced tributes to the Good Samaritan after the painting by Delacroix. The first steps based on Millet's work, and noon Rest of the Peasants, also after Millet's work. Look at how different these seemingly identical subjects are. His paintings become true works of art. Van Gogh's style brings much more movement and plasticity to the subject than the academic manner. He creates a sense of fluidity in every landscape. It's as if the wind is running through the wheat fields right now, sending waves through the seed-heavy stalks, then moving on to the cypresses, making them writhe before our eyes like dark green flames ignited by imagination. Van Gogh's moments of enlightenment. Van Gogh paints like a madman in an incredible fit of visionary inspiration and periods of enlightenment. For longer and longer periods, he himself feels a surge of confidence and becomes inspired by the idea of repainting his old works in a new style. He asks Theo to send him the potato eaters, the gleaners, the sheaf binders, and the sower, paintings with figures that he was most criticized for. Do you remember the criticism he received for the potato eaters? Van Gogh decides to give them a second life, realizing that he has reached the necessary level of mastery. Can you imagine what we could have seen if he had lived just a few more years? As Van Gogh grows stronger, the clinic's atmosphere and the monotonous landscape start to weigh on him and stifle his creativity. The medication numbs his emotions and the other patients annoy him, so he and Theo discuss Van Gogh moving closer to his brother. The atmosphere here is beginning to weigh on me in an indescribable way. Well, I endured it for more than a year, but now I need some air. I feel crushed by boredom and sadness. I have more ideas than I could ever express, but that doesn't discourage me. My thoughts settle automatically. I take it as a sign that I will regain my confidence as soon as I get to the north and get rid of my current surroundings. In May 1890, Vincent had recovered completely and he was allowed to leave the clinic. He can't return to Paris yet, and he doesn't want to, so he moves to a suburb of Paris, the town of Auvers-sur-Oise, where he comes under the care of Theo's acquaintance, Dr. Gachet, a psychiatrist. Before that, he stops in Paris for a couple of days to visit his brother and meets his wife, whom he married a year ago, and their little son, who was named Vincent. In Auvers, he keeps painting. It's beautiful there. His works become simpler, resembling Fauvism with bright colors and distorted perspective. He barely pays attention to light and shadow now. In the last 2 months, he painted more than 70 paintings, meaning he worked like a machine, creating almost one painting a day. But on July 27, 1890, an event occurred that art historians still debate to this day, and I will now tell you the most likely version. That day, as usual, he left the house with his painting supplies and went to the wheat fields near the village. But a few hours later, he staggered back, bleeding from a gunshot wound. He lay in bed at the hotel for 2 days. Theo rushed to him immediately and did everything he could. But on July 29, at the age of 37, Vincent van Gogh passed away with the words, "The sadness will last forever." I risked my life for my work and my sanity was half destroyed. These words were in his last letter, found with him on his deathbed. There are 2 theories about what happened, with the most accepted being suicide. To support this, theorists point to the generally depressive tone of his recent letters as well as his last painting, Wheatfield with Crows, which supposedly symbolizes a premonition of death. This theory sounds poetic. However, it has not been reliably proven that this was his last painting, and besides, it was far from his first painting with crows. Wounds were just a normal part of any field. The wound's location in the upper abdomen, just below the chest, contradicts this theory. Usually, people who commit suicide shoot themselves in the head or heart, and the nature of the wound does not fit the suicide theory at all. Besides, Van Gogh never had a revolver or any other firearm. And who, planning to commit suicide, would casually take painting supplies with them, not leave a note, return home, and then fight for their life for 2 days? It's hard to imagine that Van Gogh, planning to commit suicide, wouldn't at least leave a note for his brother. Since none of his vital organs were damaged by the stomach wound, he returned to the hotel and survived 2 more days. The doctors couldn't remove the bullet, and Vincent died from internal bleeding and infection. Antibiotics wouldn't be available for another 40 years, and at that time, sepsis was killing many people, so what could have happened? According to the latest research by Van Gogh's biographer, there is a theory that it was an accident. There is evidence that while Van Gogh was in Auvers, 2 teenagers were constantly playing with a revolver. And researchers have concluded that most likely it was an accident. The teenagers were messing around and accidentally shot the artist. For my part, I add with some doubt, knowing how cruel teenagers can be and how Van Gogh was viewed by others. One-eared, skinny, toothless, twitchy, half-crazy vagabond, these 2 teenagers may have started mocking the artist. It's impossible to accidentally fire a revolver and hit the only person in an endless field. At the very least, someone's hand must have aimed the barrel. "Don't blame anyone, I did it," Van Gogh answered when questioned. And these words, interpreted as a confession of suicide, rather sound like a desire to protect someone, to cover for them, like acceptance of his own fate. He was very glad that his brother came and admitted, "I would like to go, exactly so." That's how he died, in the arms of his beloved brother, surrounded by his works, already tired from this endless battle in which he had just begun to win. He was buried right here. Friends and family came to the funeral. Émile Bernard, who never made it to Arles, wrote that the coffin was covered with yellow flowers, sunflowers, his favorites. His paintings hung in the room, wheat fields, in which he saw a symbol of eternity. Local artists, Pissarro, and friends from Paris came to the funeral. Everyone was crying. Just 6 months later, Theo van Gogh also died at the age of 33 from progressive paralysis. The illness took him in just a month. He was buried in Utrecht, but in 1914 his body was exhumed and reburied next to his brother. Their graves remain side by side. At Theo's death, his widow Johanna was left with more than 200 unsold paintings by Van Gogh and over 600 of his letters. She tried to promote his art by organizing exhibitions and exchanges, sending his paintings to museums. But it took another 11 years for the world to be ready. To appreciate Van Gogh's work, a solo exhibition of the artist was held in 1901, which became a real sensation. After much discussion, expressionists like Munch, Kirchner, and Kandinsky acknowledged Van Gogh as their predecessor. In 1905, 400 of his works were exhibited in Amsterdam, and in 1914, Johanna catalogued and published Van Gogh's letters, which revealed the genius of the artist's vision and inner world, a part of which I have introduced to you today. And you? Van Gogh is recognized as a genius of colorism, and museums in Germany and France start buying his paintings. After his death, Johanna passed Van Gogh's legacy to her son Vincent, who in 1973 became one of the founders of the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, transferring the family collection there. Thus ended the story of Vincent's rise, a man who believed only in his own strength throughout his life and was elevated to the top by another Vincent. Like this video, and of course subscribe to the channel. I also have Boosty and Patreon, and I would be very grateful if you subscribed even with the smallest subscription. It would really help my channel grow. Thanks in advance, goodbye all.